If you have ever tried to set up secure remote access to your homelab network, you know how messy this gets really fast. Managing VPN configs, adding port forwardings, reverse proxies, you end up juggling multiple tools just to get basic access working. And that is exactly why tools like NetBird exist, to simplify all of this into one clean system. Now, NetBird has been around for a while, and honestly, even a few years ago, it was already pretty good, but it wasn't always exactly simple. It had multiple services, dependencies on an external identity provider, a lot of moving parts, and it couldn't really expose services to the public internet the way tools like Cloudflare tunnels or Pangolin can. But, and this is the interesting part, they completely rebuilt it. It now has a single service, it's way easier to set up, and you can even now finally expose services to the public internet built right in. But before we dive right into the new NetBird features and how to set it up, I quickly want to talk about the new game-changing AI features in Monday.com, the sponsor of today's video. Most powerful is the AI assistant Sidekick, so that can create boards, write documentation, research online, and so much more to help you not only manage your tasks, but also run your entire operations and workflow to expand what your team can deliver and save valuable time. Then there are vibe apps where you literally describe what you need in plain English, like a bug tracker, incident response workflows, a software release planner, and Monday.com just builds the entire custom app in seconds, including columns, views, automations, all of it. And with AI workflows, you can automate full process triggered by real events, like automatically analyzing ticket severity, routing it to the right team, or summarizing meeting notes. And on top of that, they're rolling out AI agents. These can execute real tasks across marketing, sales, and ops at scale. Super powerful. And if you'd like to check out Monday.com for free, of course, you will find a link in the description of this video. Alright guys, so now let's come back to NetBird and let's find out how to install and set up this thing from scratch. Before we do that, I also want to mention that NetBird actually offers two options of running it. You could also use their cloud platform, which is, by the way, free for up to 5 users. Then you don't have to manage any infrastructure at all, which is super easy to get started. But of course, you can also self-host the entire thing. And that's what we're gonna do today because, yeah, that is basically what this channel is about. And the good news is that it has become a little easier than it was before. Here's also a nice self-hosted quick start guide if you want to follow this guy's video tutorial, or you could just stay here and follow my installation guide. Of course, you have to check the infrastructure requirements before doing this. So you need a Linux VM with at least 1 CPU core and 2 gigs of memory. And the VM must be publicly accessible on TCP ports 80 and 443 and also UDP port 3478. Honestly, I don't know why they're always referring to a VM. It could, of course, also be a physical machine. And you also need a public domain name that resolves to this machine's public IP address, such as netbird.example.com. You also have to install Docker with the Docker Compose plugin. If you don't know how to do that, follow my videos or the Docker installation guide. And you also should install JQ and curl. I think these are included in most Linux distributions. And then you just have to run the installation script on your VM or physical machine, VPS, wherever you want to execute this. By the way, that leads me to the next topic that I quickly want to talk about, because you might be wondering, should you use a system that is running in your local homelab network, or should you install this on a small VPS somewhere on your favorite hosting provider? Now, I personally would always recommend you to choose a VPS and not a machine at home. Then you don't have to open the port 80, 443 and 3478 UDP on your local homelab network and forward this to the NetBird VM or container or machine. And the second reason is that your homelab basically becomes a single point of failure for any kind of network connectivity, which means, in simple words, if the server where NetBird is running dies, or if you have trouble with your network and internet connectivity at home, this of course will not work and you cannot access this platform from anywhere else. Running this on a small VPS in the cloud makes it a lot easier. and more reliable, but you still have the full control over this machine. You can decide what to install and how to set it up. For this demo tutorial, I will use a simple test machine that is running on my favorite provider Hostinger. And I've also created some DNS records on my provider Cloudflare that forward anything before the server test 7.cloud.clcreative.de to the public IP address of the VPS server. And I've also added a wildcard.netbird server test 7. That is basically a CNAME record that also points to this public IP address, so that when we are later creating any services that we want to access from anywhere, the names will always resolve to the public IP address of that VPS server. All right, so now I just need to open a shell to this remote server. So just log in, and then we just copy this one-liner command from the self-hosting tutorial, paste it into the terminal, and let the script do its job. Now here, this script asks us a couple of things. First of all, the domain name. So here I will enter NetBird server test 7 cloud.clcreative.de. I know this is kind of a long name. It also gets longer when we add some resource records, but there are ways around that, and you could later add any CNAME records to netbird.top level domain if you want. But yeah, that's the main domain name for my test setup. And here you can also see they added a couple of new things to the NetBird installation, such as a reverse proxy. So this is what we need for the new features if we want to make any services publicly available. Here I would strongly advise you to follow the NetBird's recommendation and use Traffic, because that comes with automatic TLS included in Docker Compose. It's super easy to set up. I've also made several tutorials on Traffic. I absolutely love this program. But of course, if you prefer Caddy or Nginx Proxy Manager for whatever reason, you could also switch to these here. But yeah, I'm just going with Traffic, of course. Then you also need to enter your email address. So this is needed for the Let's Encrypt certificate notifications. And you can also choose if you want to enable this proxy service at all. Yes, of course, I want to do that. And yeah, so then it's downloading all the container images, and it's creating the container. Now, because I've pulled that down before, that immediately started, but it could also take a few minutes, depending on if you're executing this on a new machine. So again, the setup is now complete. It summarizes a couple of things here, like these ports need to be open. WireGuard is optional, but these 3 ports are required. And here, this tells us that we need to create the DNS records and the CNAME record on our DNS provider, because otherwise the proxy feature is not working correctly. But yeah, that's what I showed you before in Cloudflare, so everything should be up and running. So now we can try to open the web interface of NetBird by just opening this link here. And here we can create our first admin account to get started. I'm just entering my name, my email address, and a strong password, of course. Now we can securely log in with these credentials, and we are logged in to the new NetBird web interface. Now, you could follow the installation guide. It guides you through creation of basic resources like setting up remote access, peer-to-peer network, and other things. But I'm gonna skip that, and we're going through that step by step in a minute. I still want to show you what exactly happened on our virtual machine in the terminal. It now has created a couple of configuration files and environment variables for this. Honestly, I probably should have executed this one-liner command in a directory. Otherwise, it will create all the configuration files in the current directory, which is not ideal. So yeah, you probably should take care of this if you're executing this. But what we can take a look at is the Docker Compose file. And if you've watched my first video, you might remember the old Compose stack of NetBird had many different containers. Yeah, it used Zitadel as an IDP provider with its own Postgres database, a signal server, relay, stun. There were so many different moving parts. It now has a single NetBird server that has all of the signal, relay, and stun services built right in, as well as an embedded authentication server, so that you don't have an external identity provider container. There's no extra database, no Zitadel. You just log in with a username and password and you're done. This, of course, is also much easier to upgrade. There's, by the way, a section in the documentation. So when you see a small notification on your NetBird platform that an upgrade is available, you basically just pull the new versions of the NetBird server, the dashboard, and the proxy, recreate these containers, and you're done. However, if you still want single sign-on later, of course, you can plug in external identity providers later. You can set up Authentic, Keycloak, Entra ID, or Okta as your external IDPs, but it is completely optional now. If you want to do that, there's also a separate guide for this that explains everything and how to set up these providers. But if you're just using this in a small home lab, I mean, it's just fine to use just the embedded authentication provider. All right, so now, as this is a fresh installation of the NetBird's platform, let's start creating a basic setup. And this is where I also want to introduce you to a few new concepts, because the networks now replace the old legacy network routes that we had before, which you still could use if you want, but it is much better to use the new networks feature, so that allows you to access any internal resources like local area networks, VPCs, without installing NetBird on every single machine. You just add a new network, give it a name, something like homelab, for example, and now you can start adding resources, but we will do this later. First of all, I want to add a routing peer. So think of it like just a single machine that already has the NetBird client installed, and it sits inside your local homelab network, and it acts as a gateway. So when you connect to your NetBird platform and your laptop, for example, wants to talk to a device that is inside your homelab network that does not have the NetBird client installed, a routing peer will receive the connection and forward that traffic to the target destination. So let's click on Add Routing Peer. So this takes us to the setup. You could also assign any existing routing peers to any of the networks you have created. But of course, since we haven't done this before, we need to first of all install the NetBird client and generate a setup key. So this is needed for an initial authentication to the platform. And you now could install NetBird as a routing peer on any Linux server in your network, any Windows machine. You could install it even on macOS if you want. But my preferred choice is mostly in Docker, because then it's running in a clean and isolated environment. When the container is later on deleted, there's no client application left on your internal infrastructure. So let me open a second tab on my server test1.home.creative.de. So this, of course, is now in my local network, and I think I've got a couple of testing containers here up and running. So Docker is certainly installed and it's working, and I think there's no NetBird client left here on this machine, so we can just copy and paste this single command. Of course, you can also create a Docker Compose file if you don't want this to be temporarily installed and you want to have a persistent routing peer installed and running in your network. That of course will also work. You just need to pass in the setup key once, and of course make sure the management URL points to your NetBird installation. And yeah, then let's just paste it and run it. So now we can grab for the NetBird container. So this should be up and running. Now it's initiating the connection from inside your local network, reaching out to your NetBird platform. And if you return to the UI, don't worry, you can just close this window here. And then we should be able to select the routing peer and attach it to our network. All right, so let's enable the routing peer and use the masquerade settings. So this makes sure that the access to the private networks is automatically configured so that you don't have to create static routes or anything. So that's all built right in and configured for you. Super simple. And once that is done, you should see that the network becomes active. Now, you could also add high availability. If that container dies on my testing server, there's no way to connect to my homelab network. Just add another routing peer and attach a second or third or even more routing peers to your network. Then your devices, when they start connecting to your homelab network, they will choose whatever routing peer is online and active. So if one dies, you still have a backup connection. But yeah, for our demo setup, I'm completely fine with having just one routing peer. So the network is up and running. We can now start connecting any clients and managing resources. Let's now do this. For example, I want to connect my MacBook Air to my NetBird's platform. Of course, this is still connected to my wireless network in the same local network that I want to reach, so that actually doesn't make a lot of sense. What I'll do is I will use my iPhone to share the cellular network from my mobile provider. and use this as a shared Wi-Fi connection on my laptop. So this is certainly in a completely different network, and then we can test if I can reach any of my internal resources. By the way, if you're not using a Mac, well, I'm sorry for you guys, but I can only show it on Apple devices right now. I think this is one of the good things about MacBooks. It is super simple to do things like this. For example, I can now switch off my internal Wi-Fi network on the MacBook Air and switch to my personal hotspot using my iPhone. And then I'm connecting over LTE. For example, if I try to connect to my Proxmox server, you can see this is not reachable at all. But what I can do is I can log into my NetBird platform. Back on my Mac Studio, I can just click on peers and add a new peer. I think I'm just going to download the NetBird client. I'm just going to move that over to my MacBook Air, opening it, and then just follow the installation instructions. Super simple. All right, so now we can open the settings and go to advanced settings. And of course, replace the management URL. So this is when you're using the NetBird's cloud platform with my self-hosted platform URL. Click on save and then click on connect. So this should open a new browser window where we need to log in with our credentials. And now the device is registered. So when we return to the Mac Studio again and refresh the peers page, you should see a new entry, XR local. So this is my MacBook Air. It's connecting from this IP. And you can also see the internal IP addresses inside the WireGuard network of NetBird. So this is a small and efficient VPN protocol that it's using under the hood. And now that we have this, the two peers can already connect to each other. For example, when we go back to my MacBook and I now ping the IP address of the server test 1, you can see that device already responds. Now, of course, you might wonder, how do you give your external clients access to other internal resources than just the peers that you have added? This is what you can very easily do with creating resources. So when we go back to network and click on add resource, here we can start defining services or devices inside our local homelab network that we want to make accessible through NetBird, which can be an IP address, it could be a host name, or even a wildcard domain. Yeah, and these resources don't need to have the NetBird client installed. That's the whole point. The routing peer handling the forwarding completely for us. So, for example, if I want to provide access to my Proxmox server 1, I can just enter the address prx.prod1.home.clcreative.de, click on continue. So now we can add access control policies and define source groups that are allowed to access this resource. Yeah? And here you can very specifically define what type of resources have access to what type of protocols. For example, if I say, hey, I want to give access to only my MacBook Air to access my Proxmox server, I can easily do this. And of course, it should also only reach not all ports, but the port 8006, the main management interface for Proxmox and nothing else. So then my MacBook Air is not able to connect over SSH to this Proxmox server and do anything that is harmful, but it can still access the web interface. So this way you can very granularly define who has access to what type of resources and secure the entire network. You can also add posture checks. So this is some kind of advanced feature to further restrict access to the network when clients don't comply to certain settings. For example, if they have outdated operating systems or outdated NetBird client versions and stuff like that. But yeah, we'll not go through this in that tutorial. So maybe that would be a topic for an upcoming or follow-up video if you're interested in these advanced features. Here in the resource list, you can also edit all the existing resources, activate, deactivate them, add them to resource groups if you need that for organization, or also configure the policies. And now if we open my MacBook Air again and try to access the Proxmox server, you can see that it now can reach this. Of course, if we try to ping it, it will not respond. Also, when we try to open an SSH connection, because in the access control policy, we only defined the TCP port 8006. Some people might say, well, this is nothing new. That has always been working great in NetBird. And Yeah, you're right. But I think the web interface and the process is now much cleaner. I think it has now become a lot more intuitive to set up these things. And of course, we also have a couple of new features that I want to show you. For example, the one new thing is reverse proxy. And that, guys, honestly is the one feature that made me want to make this video, because that was always a limitation of NetBird compared to other remote access tools like Cloudflare Tunnels or Pangolin. Because with this, you can take any service in your local network and expose it to the public internet, a web application, a dashboard, an API, whatever. And the interesting thing here is the person on the other end does not need to install the NetBird's VPN client. Note that this feature is still currently in beta, but I've been testing it for a while and it's been working great. A common use case I could think of is if I want to make some of my administrative services available, I would create resources in NetBird and they need to install the NetBird client, need to securely authenticate, go through the policy and post checks. But maybe I have some external clients or partners that I want to give access to an internal website maybe, then I would create it as a service. So for example, this is a simple demo website that is running on my local production network, Nginx port 1, server port 1.home.creative.de. This just prints test successful, so nothing special. But this is what we can use to test if we can make this accessible on the public internet using NetBird. First of all, we need to create an internal resource where our website service is running. So let's go back to network and let's click on add resource. Here we just say demo website and the address is now Nginx port 1 server port 1.home.creative.de. Let's click on continue. Now we also need to add a policy to provide access to this. We can now define any source that we want, and the demo website should be accessible on the TCP port 443. And yep, let's create this access, save the changes. And now, of course, we could already reach that website from within our NetBird network. For example, when we open a new browser window on my MacBook Air and enter this address, now we can reach that service inside my local network. So that's working fine. But of course, we now want to provide access to this demo website using our public NetBird address, and this we can do under reverse proxy services. And let's add a new service. This does not necessarily have to match the internal name. So instead of Nginx port 1, we can also define it just as demo web. I think demo web is fine. And now we need to say if the service type is HTTP or HTTPS. In our case, yes, that is the case. Otherwise, we could just use a simple TLS pass-through. Now, the difference between HTTPS service and TLS pass-through or TCP service is that if you choose HTTPS service, NetBird will automatically issue and obtain a trusted TLS certificate using Let's Encrypt for that service. Now, this way, you could also make unprotected web applications accessible via encrypted HTTPS from the public internet. In our case, because we already have a trusted certificate, we could also use TLS pass-through. But of course, the certificate is not really valid for the public NetBird address. So I still would prefer an HTTP or HTTPS service over everything else when it's a web application. So therefore, we're choosing this. And of course, we set the targets. So now as a target, we need to select a peer or a resource where this service is running. That's the reason why I said we first of all have to add this as a resource. I want to select the demo website. And here we can also define the protocol. We are internally also using HTTPS on port 443. Now, if you're not having a trusted TLS certificate like I do, you could enable skip TLS verification. In our case, it should still work because that demo website internally is also using HTTPS. So this way it should work. And yeah, here we can, of course, and this is also super, super interesting. Even though you can make services publicly accessible, you can still protect them with a single sign-on or with a password or with a PIN code, or require the client to send specific HTTP headers to access this service. That certainly is super useful for adding any webhooks. For example, if you have a public service, automation platform, N8N in the cloud, whatever, and you want to make an HTTP call to an internal service, but you somehow want to protect this, you can still add an HTTP header authentication if your third-party webhook provider supports basic auth, or a custom header if you want. So you're very, very flexible with the authentication. In our case, I want to make this a test website available to anybody, so without any authentication, but certainly in a production setup, if we remember the use case of an external client or external customers, at least enable a PIN code or password that you share with these guys, because that's of course much more secure than just providing access to anybody on the public internet to any internal resources. But you can if you want. So it's your decision, obviously, and you can also add any access control rules. So here you could block specific countries, specific IP address ranges, or stuff like that. So yeah, the other stuff we don't need. Let's add the service. So here you already get a warning, no protection configured. That is what I told you. You should, in production, at least add one protection method. And the cool thing is that you see that NetBird handles the TLS termination for use. You get HTTPS automatically. The traffic gets proxied through the WireGuard mesh to reach the target service. So again, your target machine doesn't need to open any ports, no firewall. All the protection and the access is controlled through the NetBird's platform here. All right, so now let's test if we can reach that. That is the internal destination accessible from within my network. And this here, demo-web.netbird server test 7 and so on, that should be accessible from anywhere in the world. Let us also test if that's true from my MacBook Air. So currently this is working because I'm connected to the NetBird's platform, but we can demonstrate what happens if we disconnect from it. And I'm now not authenticated anymore. I'm not logged into my homelab network. Yeah, if I try to reach the Proxmox service, that should not be possible anymore because that's a resource where I need to be authenticated. But the demo website, that should still be accessible from anywhere. So that is super cool. Just a quick demonstration how that would work if you add some form of authentication method. So here, for example, I could add a PIN code where I just say 11111. So that's not really secure, but yeah. Just want to show you what happens when I now reload the page. Here we are presented with an authentication required, and now if I enter the PIN code, I get access to the website. And yeah, so I think that's a pretty cool feature. You still, in my opinion, need to get a little used to it. Yeah, you have to understand what is a resource, what is a service, how is the access control working, what is a network. Network routes are also there. That might be a little confusing. What is the difference between a routing peer and a normal peer? Honestly, it could be a little more intuitive. But on the other hand, you have a lot of flexibility. You can configure many things. You can define access control very granularly, and it's very powerful. You can specifically define who is allowed to access what type of resource, through what gateway, what network, and so on. And of course, then it gets a little more complex to configure. But I think they found a good balance here. So I think this is pretty awesome. And they also added a bunch of other new cool features like the control center. This is what I absolutely love. It is not really helping a lot for my simple demo environment, but just imagine you have a larger network, not a homelab network, maybe a production company network, where you have like 100 different servers and like 200 people accessing some resources, and then you're just getting confused as an administrator. And the control center can provide you a visual way, a better overview to understand what type of resources and what services are accessible to what user groups and what teams and so on. And I think this makes a huge difference in a larger network. So this is also still in beta, but I think this is going to be a huge game changer for NetBird, and makes it, in my opinion, superior than Pangolin, for example. So that is really strong. And what you can also do is you can add custom domains here. You can add name servers to better control name resolution for any custom domains, networks. You can add new zones if you need that. So again, what I showed you today is really just the core setup and some of the new features in NetBird. Of course, it can do a lot more, but I think this is a little beyond what we actually need for a homelab setup like mine. If you like, we can certainly take a deeper look at what is all possible in a follow-up video if you want. As a summary, in my opinion, if you want a self-hosted VPN, and service exposure remote access tool in one central platform, NetBird is probably one of the best options right now and is a little superior than Pangolin, at least in my opinion. But still, if you want to explore other tools, I've also done videos about Pangolin as an alternative. Great solution in my opinion. I also made a video about Tailscale, which is also awesome, or TwinGate, that's really great for remote access. Probably a little more superior when it comes to policy and posture checks for enterprise companies. So yeah, the choices in remote access tools have not become easier, to be honest. But I hope this video helped you to get a better understanding of the new features and capabilities of NetBird, and maybe you want to try it out. Of course, you will find all the links to my internal write-up and documentation on my website, christianlemper.de, in the description box down below. And if you liked videos like this, please consider subscribing to my channels. I'm always making great tutorials for tech guys and homelab nerds like us. And a big thanks goes out to our community members and supporters. You guys are really great. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna catch you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.